Birdshot. Birdshot packs a single shotgun shell with anywhere from dozens to several hundred tiny lead, steel, or bismuth pellets, all launched together in a single blast, specifically to maximize the odds of hitting a small, fast-moving target like a clay disc or a bird in flight, rather than relying on precise aim alone. Shot size follows a genuinely counterintuitive numbering system running from roughly number 9, the smallest common pellet at just 0.08 inches across, up through number 2, with a simple trick letting anyone calculate the exact diameter themselves. Subtract the shot number from 17, and the result gives the pellet's diameter in hundredths of an inch. A rule of thumb generations of shooters have relied on rather than memorizing an entire chart. That inverse numbering means a number 9 shell carries far more individual pellets packed into the same shell than a number 4 shell does, since smaller pellets simply take up less internal volume, letting trap and skeet shooters choose a genuinely dense pattern specifically tuned for breaking a fast-moving clay target rather than punching straight through it. Competitive clay shooting disciplines like trap and skeet almost exclusively use birdshot for this exact reason, favoring that dense pattern of small, lightweight pellets over the fewer, heavier projectiles found in every other shell type covered in this video. Shot material has diversified well beyond traditional lead, too, with steel, bismuth, and tungsten alloy pellets all now common on store shelves, each offering shooters a genuinely different balance of cost, density, and environmental regulation compliance depending on where and how the shell ultimately gets used. Bismuth in particular emerged specifically as a compromise material for shooters using older, more delicate shotguns, unable to safely handle harder steel shot, since bismuth alloys approach lead's original density and softness while still meeting the same non-toxic requirements steel shot was originally created to satisfy. Buckshot. Buckshot swaps birdshot's dozens of tiny pellets for a much smaller number of substantially larger ones, ranging from the smallest common size, number 4 buck at roughly 0.24 inches across, up through the largest standard designation, 00 buck pronounced 000, measuring a full 0.36 inches in diameter across a single pellet. A typical 12-gauge shell loaded with 00 buckshot, read as 00, holds around 8 or 9 individual pellets, each one weighing roughly 53 grains. Genuinely comparable to the weight of many rifle bullets fired from a completely different class of firearm entirely. That combination of multiple substantial projectiles launched simultaneously from a single trigger pull is exactly why 00 buckshot became the standard law enforcement and home defense load across the country, delivering considerably more stopping power per shot than birdshot's swarm of lightweight pellets could ever manage against a genuinely large target. Unlike birdshot's tiny, easily poured pellets, buckshot pellets are large enough that manufacturers have to carefully stack them inside the shell in specific layers rather than simply pouring loose shot into the hull, a small but genuine manufacturing distinction between the two shell categories. Buckshot's own name traces directly back to its original intended use against deer, a buck, and while single projectile slugs have since largely replaced buckshot for actual deer hunting in most American states, the name itself stuck around permanently, even as the round's primary modern application shifted almost entirely toward personal defense and law enforcement work instead. Pellet count within a given shell also varies noticeably depending on shell length, since a longer 3-inch 12-gauge hull can physically hold several more pellets of the exact same size than a standard 2 3/4-inch shell, giving shooters a genuine trade-off between increased recoil and additional pellets on target with every single trigger pull. The slug. Rather than any number of separate pellets, a slug shell fires one single, solid projectile, effectively turning a shotgun into a short-range rifle capable of reaching targets far beyond buckshot's practical limits and delivering considerably more penetrating energy in a single concentrated mass. German gunmaker Wilhelm Brennecke patented the first successful slug design in 1898, a solid lead projectile with a distinctive wasp-waisted rear section that stabilized its flight much like a badminton shuttlecock rather than through any genuine spin imparted by rifling. A genuinely clever aerodynamic solution for an era when spinning a smoothbore projectile simply wasn't mechanically possible. American gunsmith Carl Foster improved on that concept in 1931, born directly out of Depression-era necessity, designing a hollow-based slug with a rounded nose that moved the projectile's center of mass forward, extending practical accuracy out to roughly 75 yards from a completely smooth, unrifled barrel. Foster reportedly developed his design specifically to help struggling neighbors put deer meat on the table during the hardest years of the Great Depression, hand casting as early as slugs and filing rifling-style grooves into the sides by hand, before any real commercial manufacturing process existed for the design he'd eventually become famous for across the entire American shooting sports industry. Modern sabot slugs push that concept even further, encasing a smaller diameter projectile inside a plastic sleeve that engages the rifling of a specially rifled shotgun barrel before falling away entirely once it leaves the muzzle, letting a properly matched sabot slug and rifled barrel combination reach genuinely rifle-like accuracy out past 100 yards, a dramatic improvement over either the Foster or Brennecke designs that came before it and defined the category for nearly a century. The less lethal beanbag round. Following the civil unrest and campus protests of the late 1960s, a presidential commission studying American law enforcement specifically recommended developing non-lethal alternatives to standard buckshot, leading directly to the beanbag round's creation as one of the very first genuinely practical results of that broader national research effort into reducing fatal police encounters. A beanbag round replaces solid shot entirely with a small, flexible fabric pouch filled with roughly 40 grams of lead shot, launched from a standard 12-gauge shotgun at a relatively modest 250 to 300 feet per second, specifically so the bag flattens out and delivers a blunt, spread-out impact rather than penetrating the target the way any conventional shell would. That design is explicitly built to incapacitate rather than kill, distributing the round's impact energy across roughly 1 square inch of a target's body, though manufacturers and law enforcement trainers still classify it as less lethal rather than non-lethal, acknowledging that a poorly placed hit can still cause serious injury under the wrong circumstances. Early beanbag designs actually fell out of favor entirely by the late 1970s after a teenager died from a heart injury sustained from a hit to the chest. A tragedy serious enough that the original manufacturer eventually went out of business before 2 separate companies reintroduced improved versions of the concept in 1990 with better documented safety guidelines. Modern departments almost universally load beanbag rounds into shotguns specifically marked or colored differently from their lethal counterparts, a deliberate visual distinction meant to prevent the exact kind of dangerous mix-up that could occur if an officer grabbed the wrong shotgun during a genuinely high-stress encounter where seconds and split-second decisions genuinely matter. Some agencies go a step further still, dedicating an entire shotgun exclusively to less lethal rounds and storing it in a visually distinct rack or case specifically so no officer ever has to double-check which shell type currently sits in the chamber before pulling the trigger in the field. If you've ever wondered how many different jobs one shotgun can do just by swapping the shell, that's the kind of versatility this channel keeps exploring. Subscribe if you want the next one broken down the same way. The breaching round. Military and law enforcement entry teams needed a way to defeat a locked door's hinges or deadbolt without the genuine ricochet risk that firing standard buckshot at close range against solid metal hardware would create inside a confined hallway or stairwell, leading directly to the development of the dedicated breaching round as its own distinct ammunition category. Rather than lead or steel shot, a breaching round packs its shell with a dense, sintered metal powder held together in a wax or polymer binder, a projectile hard enough to shatter a lock mechanism or hinge on impact before instantly disintegrating into fine, harmless dust, rather than continuing downrange as a genuinely lethal projectile capable of injuring anyone standing behind that same door. That frangible design earned the round an unofficial nickname among some police tactical units, the Master Key, alongside a corresponding radio code phrase, Avon calling, borrowed cheekily from the door-to-door cosmetics company's own famous slogan. British Special Forces units have used breaching rounds fired from standard pump-action shotguns for decades, and specialized systems like the Knight's Armament Master Key mount an entire dedicated breaching shotgun directly underneath a rifle's barrel, letting an entry team clear a locked door without ever swapping to a completely separate weapon mid-operation. Companies like Royal Arms have manufactured dedicated breaching ammunition under the Tsar name for over 4 decades now, refining the exact frangible copper formulation and weight distribution across that entire span, specifically to balance genuinely reliable lock destruction against minimizing any risk to whoever might be standing on the opposite side of that same door during an actual operation. Specialized standoff attachments mounted directly onto a breaching shotgun's muzzle add yet another layer of safety to the entire process, pressing flush against the door itself and venting excess gas pressure sideways rather than allowing it to build up and blow back toward the operator holding the weapon. Steel shot. Federal regulators banned lead shot for waterfowl hunting across the entire United States starting in 1991, responding to mounting scientific evidence that ducks and geese were regularly ingesting spent lead pellets alongside the small stones they naturally swallow to help digest food, leading to fatal lead poisoning across wetland bird populations nationwide over the course of many hunting seasons. That evidence had accumulated for decades before the rule finally took effect, with wildlife biologists tracking declining waterfowl populations, specifically in heavily hunted wetland areas where spent shot accumulated most densely on the shallow lake and marsh bottoms birds naturally fed from. Steel shot answered that regulatory requirement by replacing lead entirely with a genuinely different non-toxic metal, but steel's significantly lower density compared to lead meant manufacturers had to noticeably increase pellet size just to maintain comparable energy on target, since a steel pellet of the exact same diameter as a lead one simply weighs less and carries less momentum downrange. That density difference also changed how shooters had to think about shotgun chokes entirely, since the harder, less deformable steel pellets patterned differently than soft lead ever did, and many older shotguns built before the transition needed specific steel-rated barrels or chokes to avoid genuine damage from the harder material passing through a barrel never engineered to handle it. The steel shot mandate remains one of the most significant pieces of environmental regulation in American shooting sports history, directly reshaping an entire category of ammunition manufacturing within just a few short years of the original 1991 federal rule taking effect nationwide. And it paved the way for later non-toxic alternatives like bismuth and tungsten alloy, shot to enter the same market for shooters seeking ballistic properties closer to traditional lead performance. State and federal wildlife agencies continue monitoring waterfowl lead exposure levels even decades after the ban took effect, tracking whether the regulation actually achieved its intended goal of measurably reducing lead-related mortality across affected bird populations nationwide. The shotshell for handguns. Ammunition manufacturers eventually shrank the entire birdshot concept down into pistol calibers entirely, packing tiny lead pellets into cartridges chambered for everything from .22 long rifle up through 9mm and .45 ACP, creating a genuinely specialized category of ammunition nicknamed snake shot for its most common practical use out on rural properties and farmland. That miniaturization required real engineering compromises too, since a cartridge case originally sized for a single bullet suddenly needed to hold dozens of tiny pellets, a capsule, and enough propellant to launch the whole payload, reliably without the reduced powder charge, causing the action to short cycle in a semi-automatic pistol. CCI's own Shotshell line remains the best-known example, using a specially crimped plastic capsule instead of a traditional bullet to hold that small charge of shot together as it travels down a rifled pistol barrel, since rifling designed for a single spinning projectile would otherwise scatter loose shot pellets unevenly and unpredictably. These specialized rounds deliver genuinely minimal effective range, typically well under 15 feet, specifically because a pistol barrel's rifling and short length were never designed to pattern shot the way a smoothbore shotgun barrel naturally does, making them a purpose-built tool for extremely close-range pest control rather than any kind of general-purpose defensive round. Rural property owners and outdoor workers have kept this niche category commercially viable for decades, specifically because a handgun already carried for other reasons can double as a genuinely effective tool against snakes, rodents, and other small pests encountered at arm's length, without needing to carry an entirely separate firearm just for that one occasional task. The Flechette Round. During the Vietnam War, American ordnance researchers experimented with an entirely different shotgun projectile concept, the Flechette Round, replacing conventional lead shot with a payload of small finned steel darts designed to fly straighter and penetrate deeper than any round-lead pellet ever could at extended range through dense jungle foliage. Researchers hoped the tiny darts, each shaped somewhat like a miniature lawn dart with stabilizing fins at the rear, would combine Buckshot's wide dispersal pattern with a rifle bullet's superior penetration and range, essentially trying to split the difference between two completely different ammunition categories in one experimental shell. The concept borrowed directly from earlier Flechette artillery shells used in both World Wars, miniaturizing that same finned dart design down to a scale a standard 12-gauge shell could actually contain and launch effectively downrange. Testing reportedly showed the tiny darts could tumble unpredictably in flight, and sometimes failed to stabilize properly once they left the barrel, reliability concerns serious enough that the round never saw the same widespread official adoption conventional buckshot and slugs eventually achieved across the broader military establishment. Some accounts from that same testing period suggest the Flechette darts occasionally struggled to reliably penetrate even light barriers at extended range, undermining the exact advantage over conventional buckshot the entire concept had originally set out to prove in the first place. The Flechette shotgun round remains today primarily a historical curiosity and a genuine collector's novelty item rather than a mainstream ammunition category, a reminder that not every experimental military ammunition concept from that era went on to reshape how a weapon gets used decades later.